So there are many ways to appreciate and study works of art, many angles from which to approach each and every object in our collection. So for us as curators, when we decide to include an object in the gallery, such as our museum collections gallery here at the Aga Khan, there are many options for how we might choose to describe that object on the rather small label that we have to convey a wealth of information. We can think about the works of art in our collection from the point of view of how they were made and the materials used to create them. Or we could focus on the imagery in a painting or on an object and interpret its symbolism within the culture that it was produced. We could look into the biography of the artist if we happen to know who made it, and where in his or her career the production of a particular piece might fall. Or we could even think about the person for whom the work of art was created, why they commissioned it, and sort of how they viewed that particular object. But given that we have only a limited way of touching on any of these points when we present something in the galleries, usually our labels are about 75 words, we have to pick and choose among the many stories that we could share with our visitors. That means there are many stories that we don't get to tell. And something that's often left out of museum labels are the bits and pieces of information we have about the object's history, from the moment it was made until the moment when it entered our museum and where you, the visitor, encounter it today. But there are in fact many fascinating pieces of information about the objects in every museum, and in our collection in the AKM, we're privileged to have a set of works once belonging to the Mughal emperors of South Asia, things that they prized enough to put their own seal or inscription on. These are a range of items made in different places and times. And it's thrilling to think about these famous towering figures in history, the emperors Shah Jahan, Jahangir, or Alamgir, once handling and admiring the very same objects that you also can admire and examine up close in the galleries. So the first of these objects relating to the Mughal collections is a late 16th century manuscript from Iran. It contains the stories and illustrations of a text called the Ambari Suhaili. In English, this translates to the Lights of the Canopus, but in the original Persian, this title is a pun on the name of the constellation Suhaili, or Canopus, and the name Suhaili of the person to whom the author dedicated his book. The text is in Persian, and it consists of a series of animal fables passed on, based on stories that had been passed down for centuries between India, Iran, and the Arabic-speaking world. These stories were crafted as a way to provide advice on governance and ethics to rulers and their courtiers. And this story, for instance, tells the tale of a traveler who comes upon a pit where he hears shouts coming out, and he rescues a snake and a monkey and a tiger from inside, and they beg him not to let the final person who's trapped in there out, a goldsmith, but he does anyway, and he comes to regret this choice later on. So a total of 107 stories like this were arranged within a framing narrative of a conversation between a ruler and his advisor. Each of these stories is beautifully illustrated in the text with vignettes that convey not only the main points of the narrative, but that also capture details of daily life in the late 16th century in Iran. So here's a view into a home where a woman is spinning thread, maybe with dinner bubbling in the cauldron on the back, and her drinking water cooling in an earthenware jug in the front. But actually the main subject of this story are the two cats that appear here in the margins and a conversation between them. Now, interestingly, this manuscript is thought to have been created by a painter named Sadiki Beg for his own use and pleasure. This information comes from a rather informative colophon, the name for an inscription at the end of a manuscript that tells us where and when it was made. This colophon on the screen now and attached to this manuscript notes that Sadiki Beg, who is not only an artist but also director of the Royal Library of the Safavid Court of Iran, had the idea for the manuscript and, we believe, contributed the paintings. The note further states that the text was copied out by Naim Mohammed al-Husseini al-Tabrizi and completed on the date of 13 Safar 1002 in the Hijri calendar, which converts to 8 November 1593. Now, when we turn to the front of the manuscript, we find another note, and this one states that it was presented to an emperor named Jahangir in the year 1618. Therefore, the manuscript had somehow traveled out of Iran, where Jahangir was ruler of the Mughal Empire and based in northern India. So he would have been neighbor and rival to the Safavid kingdom, where Sadiki Beg was situated. Jahangir was emperor between 1605 and 1627, but even before he came to the throne, he had established a paintings workshop, and he is known as a lifelong connoisseur of manuscripts and paintings. Both from a point of view of the contents of this volume, a classic text of Persian literature and one that provides guidance for rulers such as him, the quality of its illustrations were also very high. They were made by a top-notch artist. And so this manuscript would have made a very worthy gift for Jahangir. And it appears that it stayed in the Mughal treasury for several generations. That history is indicated by the note itself, which is written by one of Jahangir's sons, as well as the 4 seals, now effaced, that we can just make out around the inscription, but likely representing subsequent dates of inventorying in the imperial collections. There is also an inscription giving a value or price, the word here in Persian is qiymat, of 265 mohors, which is a gold coin. Seeing the type of work that Jahangir collected and admired is instructive in conversation with the manuscripts that Jahangir actually himself sponsored, such as this one in our collection that has been traditionally attributed to his patronage. The colophon at the end of the manuscript does not name him, but it indicates that it was copied by the famed calligrapher Abdurrahim al-Harabi, known by the name of Amber Pen, who was active at the Mughal court during Jahangir's reign. A knowledge of his dates, together with a stylistic analysis of the painting, suggests that the manuscript was completed around the year 1604. The text is the collected works of the poet Saadi. Born in the 13th century in Shiraz, Iran, Saadi took his pen name in honor of his patron, Saad ibn Zengi, ruler of the province of Fars, and the two are shown in this scene from the manuscript, in which the poet in the black and white striped coat presents his work to Saad ibn Zengi. The manuscript includes Saadi's most famous poems, the Bustan and the Gulistan, as well as a number of other compositions. The poems are accompanied by 23 gorgeous paintings, and 2 of these have been ascribed to the Mughal artists Dharmdas and Hiranan, meaning that their names appear underneath the paintings, as seen on this folio, where the name Dharmdas has been noted in red ink, most likely by the painting's workshop director as a way of assigning the work to the artist under his supervision. So this isn't necessarily a signature. This particular painting depicts a part of the poem Bustan, or the orchard. At one point in his extensive travels, Saadi made his way into India, and he stopped at the great temple of Somnath, where he engaged in religious discussion with Hindu priests. Saadi spoke to them about Islam, and in turn, the priest showed him how that temple's idol made gestures in response to their prayers. Saadi was at first a little puzzled, perhaps a little impressed, but then he inspected the statue at night and discovered that there was a mechanical device hidden in it that was actually responsible for moving the idol's arms. So on the following day, he confronted the priest with his discovery, and so the moral is that this proved the superiority of Islam in the end. So as I said, the paintings illustrate these well-loved and well-known poems from Saadi's work, but they update the people mentioned in them to the Mughal era, as in the case of the biblical figure Moses, who is mentioned in one of Saadi's poems. So here he's wearing a floral sash of a type popular in the early 17th century, and he's walking in front of a Mughal-style red sandstone fort rather than appearing in his own ancient times. While we presume the manuscript was made for Jahangir, we know for certain that it was in the possession of his son Shah Jahan, who ruled as emperor from 1628 until 1658. In the public mind, this emperor is probably most associated with the Taj Mahal, the magnificent tomb in Agra. That's one of the most famous buildings in the world. But based on the objects of art in his collections, we know that he also had an eye for and a highly refined sense of appreciation for other kinds of art. And his seal has been added to the first page of this manuscript, on the reverse of where the text starts. The seal reads, Lord of the Second Conjunction, Shahabuddin Muhammad Shah Jahan, Emperor Victorious. That mark would have been made with a seal much like the one that Shah Jahan is holding in the portrait in our own collection, and that is shown on the left here. The seal in the painting has nearly the identical inscription, but it's arranged in a circular rather than a teardrop shape. Next to the seal impression is an inscription that has been scratched through, and we are hoping to use some infrared or other methods to raise up the inscription covered up by the scrawls, and maybe they might give us some more information about the history of this manuscript. Another object we know once belonged to Shah Jahan is this ewer or pitcher that was made in China in the early 15th century, so therefore about 200 years before it arrived in the Mughal treasury. This type of object is very well known and highly prized in the Chinese sphere. It's one of dozens of such types made at the imperial kilns for the Ming ruler known as the Yongle Emperor, who sent them out to all parts of his kingdom as a form of cultural diplomacy. This type of ewer has a long history in Tibet, in fact. It was the shape of usually metal or wooden vessels that were used during feasts, and that might have been also displayed in front of Buddhist altars, along with textiles and other offerings. When this type of object traveled to China, it was given the name of a monk's cap ewer because it was thought to resemble the distinctive kind of hat worn by Tibetan monks. Because of that name, there's been some confusion about whether this type of object was used in religious rituals, but we don't believe that's the case. The Yongle ewers were given as gifts, and so movement was inherent in their creation. And therefore, it's not altogether unexpected that this one traveled as far as India. Following centuries of trade between China and South Asia, and an increase in particular in the trade of ceramics in the 9th century, we have evidence that rulers in the region were assembling rather large and impressive collections of Chinese wares from at least the 15th century. Therefore, by the time the Mughal emperors came to power in northern India in 1526, it was not only accustomed to collect porcelain in the Persian cultural sphere from which they emerged, but also in northern India. The Emperor Jahangir talks at one point in his memoirs about the rarity and quality of Chinese porcelains that he has been presented as gifts. And he says that he can distinguish porcelains from different parts of China. So on the screen now are examples of Chinese porcelains that were once in the Mughal treasuries, just like our object. And we know this because they're all inscribed. And here are the details of those inscriptions on the backs and bottoms of each of these objects. And they happen to all give the name or titles of Emperor Shah Jahan. That puts our own Ur in very good company indeed, for on the thumb rest of our piece is an inscription reading Shah Jahan, son of Jahangir, the emperor, and a date, 1053, in the Hijri calendar, which converts to 1643 or 44 of the Common Era. As we've seen, there are a number of other inscribed Chinese objects bearing Shah Jahan's name, and it gives some sense of the esteem in which he held these items, as well as his diverse tastes. As we saw in the previous slide, these objects that he collected range from blue and white wares to this rather subtle and refined form with no decoration, but instead an impossibly perfect shape and glaze. This shows that the Mughals were not simply acquiring newly made objects of high quality, but sought items made centuries earlier and that must have been in prized and important collections from the time that they were made. Next, we come to a rather different sort of object, one that doesn't necessarily represent the heights of artistic achievement, but that nonetheless was repeatedly marked with Mughal inventory notes. It is a copy of a text called the Book of the Images of the Fixed Stars. This text was written in the 10th century by a scientist named As-Sufi, who had been appointed court astronomer in Shiraz, Iran. It describes the 48 constellations known as the fixed stars, based on but commenting and updating the work of Ptolemy, the Greek astronomer. Long after As-Sufi's death, his work continued to be copied and studied by astronomers, for it contained valuable information about the size, location, and associated folklore of each of the 48 constellations. Thus, we have this copy made about 600 years later, reproducing As-Sufi's text, along with the images of the constellations and the main stars within them, each carefully labeled. Following the typical format of copies of As-Sufi, the constellations are shown twice, once as visible in the sky to us standing on Earth, and once as visible from a point in the heavens and looking downward. So here, that's why we have these mirror images of the constellation Delphinus, one from the sky and one from the Earth. While the names and configurations of the constellations were in some cases based on traditions specific to the Arabic and Persian-speaking world, some remain immediately recognizable to us, since our traditions also derive from the ancient Greek ones. You might know these two, for example, as Leo and Cancer, the lion and the crab in Arabic. We believe this copy of As-Sufi's text was made and illustrated in Isfahan in Iran sometime in the 1640s or 50s. But once again, information found on the first page of the manuscript tells us how it traveled to the Mughal treasury and then continued to be inventoried there for several decades. The note scrawled on the left side of the page says that it was presented by someone named Muhammad Hadi to someone else named Fazail Khan in the year 1104 Hijri, which converts to 1692-93 of the Common Era. As indicated by the seal below the note, we know that Fazail Khan was librarian to the Emperor Alamgir, son of Shah Jahan, about whom we've just been speaking. Alamgir ruled between 1658 and 1707, and after his death, the manuscript passed to his son and successor, Shah Alam I, And two of that emperor's librarians added their seals as well, and these are seen to the right of the initial note. Finally, our last example from the museum's collection is this drawing of an elephant. Drawn with brush and ink, it's been completed with delicate shading and details, especially around the head and the trunk. And silver bells and ornaments have been added, and these are now tarnished, of course, to black here, but the originally must have been quite stunning. The drawing has no signatures or inscriptions to tell us where it was made or by whom, but the general consensus is that it was created in one of the sultanates in central India in the Deccan in the mid-17th century. It is thought to be the portrait of a specific elephant, and this might seem like an unusual practice now, but in fact it was fairly common for particularly prized animals, especially elephants that had a very high value, to be represented in paintings and drawings. After its creation, the drawing was placed in borders made of gold-flecked pinky orange paper. It was then mounted on a larger page of plain paper, and gold rulings were added around it. Both were presumably done so that the drawing could be included in an album. Inscriptions were added in Persian, reading Kanis or Ganesh, Bahis, and in Hindi, also reading Ganesh, the name of the Hindu elephant-headed god, and thus an appropriate name for this elephant, if we can believe that the later owners of the drawing had recorded his name. These additions, we assume, took place separately from the making of the drawing, which seems to have made its way to northern India from the Deccan fairly soon after its creation. As part of this later period of ownership, it was also stamped by one of Alamgir's librarians using a stamp dated 1686 to 87, and it was marked with the word fourth here, as you can see in this detail, meaning fourth class in the ranking system of the Mughal library. And finally, it was given a value, this mark here, which you can see slightly larger down here. So this is a 7, indicating 7 rupees in a numerical coding system called Rakam. So I wanted to highlight these objects because even if they're rather disparate, they comprise an interesting supplement to the documents that our histories are typically based on. While it's one thing to know the basic facts of the emperor's lives and reigns, to talk about the lands that they captured or the laws that they passed, we learn about an altogether different side of their personalities through their collections. We start to think, what were they reading? What kinds of paintings did they enjoy? And it's interesting to speculate what they knew about the lands where these objects were made, and what did they appreciate about each of these enough to put their own mark on them. I also bring out this aspect of the objects as a way to make a highly personal connection between us, these museum objects, and these important figures. We ourselves are looking at, and in my case, getting to touch even, the very objects that they handled. Something that always, kind of blows my mind that I'm in this position as curator. And finally, I wanted to highlight the similarities between their practices of marking, inventorying, and evaluating objects and our museum practices today, in the way that we mark objects with the museum accession numbers, we track their locations in our database and perform inventory checks from time to time. We also record how we acquired objects and research their provenance. And indeed, even assign them insurance values, much the way that these three figures added notations and similar valuations to their own objects in their own personal museums. So that is a brief introduction to these this selection from our museum. Thank you.